Before we get into the details of creating a podcast, let's first take a quick overview of the basic steps of the process. The first step before you record a single word is to plan out your podcast. Figure out what your show is going to be about, how long it will run, how often you're going to produce new episodes, and so on. Ask yourself questions like, what is your show going to be about? What kind of format will it be in? Will it just be you talking into a microphone for half an hour? Will you have a co-host or guests? What about background music? Will you interview people over the phone or maybe through a program like Skype? Questions like these can inform other decisions you'll need to make, such as what equipment you'll need in order to properly record and edit your podcast. Now, this isn't to say your show won't or can't evolve. It most likely will, but having a basic idea of the format is critical at the beginning. Once you've developed that basic idea, you can start thinking about what you'll need to record your podcast. You're going to need a computer, in our case a Mac, since we're going to be using GarageBand as our recording and editing software. And you'll need at least one microphone, a way to connect the microphone to your Mac, and at least one set of headphones so you can hear what you're doing both when you're recording and when you're editing. You'll also want to consider your recording location. Do you have a desk or a work area that you can use to record and edit at, or will you need more room? Do you need to do any soundproofing? The kind of gear you get will depend on your budget, which is something else you'll have to figure out. Your initial outlay at the beginning is probably going to be the most expensive because you'll need all of your gear up front. But also consider monthly costs that you may need, like a hosting service for when you upload your podcast online, or if you're going to have a companion website for your podcast, which is pretty common. But once you have your gear and recording location set up, it's time to record your show. This involves recording your voice tracks and any other sounds like music or effects that you intend to use. And again, we'll be looking at how to do that with GarageBand in this course. Once it's recorded, you'll need to edit your show. Unless you record everything perfectly, of course, but chances are that even if you're going for a loose and spontaneous style, you'll still need to do some cleaning up. Once you have your show finalized, it's time to convert it into an MP3 file, which is still the most widely accessible format for audio files. And then it's time to send your podcast out into the world by copying it or publishing it to a web server somewhere out there on the internet. At that point, you'll have a downloadable podcast. But to make it so people can subscribe to your podcast, you'll also need to create an RSS feed. An RSS feed is an XML file that contains the description of your podcast, a link to the audio file, and all the other information you see when you view a podcast information in a podcast app. If you know XML, you can hand code the RSS file. If you don't know XML, the hosting service you're using may do all the necessary coding for you. And once you've created your RSS feed, you can then submit it to the podcast directories of your choice, as well as to the iTunes Store, so people can actually find your podcast. And that's the basic gist of creating a podcast. GarageBand only plays one part in this entire process, but it's the important part of recording and editing your show. Still, there's a lot of work to do before you get to that point. So next, let's get down to details and take a look at several things you'll want to consider when planning out your podcast.